Welcome to Barren Horizon, a Western novel. Written by Ken Cannon. Narrated by Richard Pulsifer. Copyright 2023 by BrooksAudiobooks.com and Shadowplay Communications, LLC. All rights reserved. No portion of this book may be reproduced in any form without written permission from the publisher or author. Visit BrooksAudiobooks.com for updates on the availability of new books and a special free offer. Chapter 1. Anthony Fraser stared down the Red River with a mix of determination and uncertainty. The Rio Colorado was a treacherous body of water, its muddy and turbulent currents threatening to engulf anything in its path. As he stood on the bank, he looked out at the vast expanse of the desert that lay before him, a barren wasteland of towering peaks and endless sand dunes. Without a second thought, Anthony rushed down to the water's edge and threw his pack into a small boat. But as he began to push off, a sudden wave of emotion overtook him. He turned back to the dusty town of Ehrenberg, now silent and still in the scorching midday heat. A lone Indian stood in the shade of a wall, watching Anthony with a stoic expression. Tears streamed down Anthony's face as he cried out in anguish. "Carl is no brother of mine any more," he exclaimed, "and as for her, I'll never think of her again." His voice was filled with bitterness and heartbreak, the pain of a love lost and a family torn apart. But as he turned back to the river, something stirred within him. Anthony was just 18 years old, tall and lean, with a handsome, sun-kissed face. He felt a sense of excitement and adventure coursing through his veins, a desire to explore the unknown and discover what lay beyond the horizon. With a sense of purpose, Anthony untied the boat and set out onto the river. The silent water beckoned to him, its calm surface hiding a world of mystery and possibility. For Anthony, there was no turning back. The call of the wild had taken hold, and he was determined to see where it would lead him. No longer would Anthony be controlled by his selfish brother Carl, who had taken everything and given nothing in return. The thought of Carl being hurt by Anthony's departure briefly crossed his mind, but he quickly pushed it aside. Despite their long history together, Anthony's resentment was too strong. As he looked out at the red Colorado River, he saw a gateway to adventure and freedom in the vast desert beyond. "I'm leaving," he declared with passion, shoving the boat away and jumping into the rowing seat. The boat lazily circled before being caught by the current and carried downstream. Anthony felt the power of the river taking hold of him, knowing that there was no turning back. He left behind Ehrenberg, his only living relative Carl, and the little love that had failed him. "I'm done with Carl forever," he muttered, his eyes hard and dry. "It's all his fault. Mother warned me." Anthony's thoughts trailed off, wishing he were still at home instead of in this desolate wasteland among ruthless men and women. He pulled out a glittering bottle from his pack and took a deep drink, waving it defiantly at the fading scene behind him before flinging it away with disgust. He had no love for alcohol, and the bottle sank into the river with a hollow splash. With a long and forceful pull, Anthony applied himself to the oars. As he rowed, memories flooded his mind, vivid and unforgettable. He thought of his old homestead back east, his mother's sad face, and the mystery surrounding his father's death during his childhood. There seemed to be a vague connection between these memories and his current situation, alone on that desert river. When his mother passed away, she had left all her money to him, but he had shared it with his brother Carl. Little did he know that small fortune would be the beginning of evil days. Carl squandered his share, disgraced himself in their hometown, and began to constantly pressure Anthony to leave college and seek adventure. Anthony, wanting to be with his brother and experience wildlife for himself, eventually gave in to the temptation. Although he chose to travel westward by land, Carl fell in with a bad crowd and became a gambler in Tucson. Even Anthony wasn't spared from his brother's practices. Eventually, Carl found himself in Ehrenberg, a mining and outfitting post far from civilization, where he made friends compatible with his newfound tastes. There, he even managed to win the affections of someone who had first smiled upon Anthony. As the June sun beat down upon the Colorado Desert and its Red River, Anthony rowed with fierce determination. The scorching sun beat down on Anthony Fraser as he lay half-drunk and completely helpless in the leaky boat, which was at the mercy of the Rio Colorado's current. This river was unlike any other, with a hue that was impossible to describe but somehow still red, like lifeless blood. It was born from high altitudes, fed by countless lakes and streams, and raged through its canyoned confines with an unstoppable force. Even as it slowed and leveled out, it remained immense and unyielding, carrying with it sand and silt across the desert. The boat that carried Fraser was tossed around like a rudderless craft in an ocean current, spinning in eddies and drifting closer to the shore with each passing moment. As the hot afternoon hours turned into a blazing sunset without a single cloud in the sky, birds flew overhead and desert buzzards circled in the distance. Fraser's boat continued to drift, eventually being pulled into a back eddy where it spun round and round until it finally caught hold of the arrowweeds and became lodged in a thicket. When Fraser awoke at dawn, he was sober but sick and in pain, his throat parched with thirst. The eastern horizon glowed with the promise of another day, and even in his misery, Fraser felt a thrill of hope. He scooped up the cold, muddy water which tasted of snow and drank deeply before using it to bathe his hot face. After unpacking his supplies, Anthony rummaged for the food he had meticulously brought along. He then attempted to orient himself, noticing the mark on the arrowweeds indicating that the flood had receded by a foot during the night. It was reasonable to assume that he had floated many miles downstream. "I'll row until it gets too hot, then take a break in the shade," he decided. He pushed off from the weeds, set the oars, and began rowing towards the current. As soon as it caught him, the motion became exhilarating. Eventually, between the exercise, the cool morning breeze on his face, and the sweet, damp aroma of the river lowlands, he began to shake off the effects of the alcohol and the disgust and feeling of inadequacy that came with it. The gloom gradually lifted from his mind, though a twinge persisted in his chest. It was a familiar sensation. Determined, he faced the vast, meandering river, grateful for something indescribable that seemed to be carried on its surface. He was aware of a strange expansion in his soul, eager to see, hear, smell, feel, and taste the wildness and wonder of freedom as he had imagined it. As the sun rose, Anthony's face and hands felt as if they had been touched by a hot, tangible object. He began to sweat, which was all that was required to restore his usual healthy bodily sensation. Every now and then he spotted herons, other long-legged waterfowl, and snipe darting over the sandbars, as well as somber gray birds that he couldn't identify. The desert or river spell hung over these birds. The silence was pervasive, like an invisible blanket that covered everything, water, bushes, and land. "It's the silence of the desert," he said in amazement. When he lifted the oars and rested them, there was no sound at all. As Anthony sailed down the river, he was struck by the realization that he was truly free. The warm breeze carried with it the scents of the land, both sweet and sour. The sun beat down on him, a welcome feeling after the bitter cold of the winter months. He loved the warmth of the sun and the way it made him feel alive. Maybe, just maybe, his brother Carl had been right in urging him to head west. Anthony felt a resurgence of hope, like a boy again. As the Mexicans say, quien sabe, who knows what the future holds? Eventually, Anthony spotted a safe-looking spot to land his boat. The cove was clear of brush and the bank was gentle. As he climbed the bank, he began to see the mountains surrounding him, their tips gleaming in the sun. "By Jove," he exclaimed, "no sign of man, no sign of life." He climbed to the top of a nearby knoll and gazed out at the stunning view. He had never been so high up before. To the south, the Colorado River wound its way through the mountains, disappearing from sight. After a brief rest and a bite to eat, Anthony settled in for a nap. His thoughts drifted to his brother Carl and the bond they'd once shared. But now that bond was broken, irreparable. Anthony felt a pang in his heart, a deep ache that he knew would never go away. He hid his face in the dry grass, feeling the loneliness of the desert. "I can fight, I can forget," he muttered to himself. Anthony pondered his immediate future and where he would go next. He had two options, a mining camp called Picacho or a frontier town called Yuma. Both places had intriguing tales surrounding them, and Anthony felt a sense of eagerness for adventure. However, he also felt a tinge of sadness as he realized his old dream of a successful and useful life was slipping away. Eventually, he drifted off to sleep. When he woke up, he was covered in sweat and saw a luminous gold light shining through the willows. He had slept for hours and heard rustlings in the willows which made him feel both interested and cautious. As he had traveled across Arizona before, he knew about the dangers of bad Indians, Mexicans, and white men, as well as the fierce beasts and reptiles of the desert. Anthony braced himself for any encounters that might come his way. When he stepped out of the willows, he saw that the river and valley were shrouded in immense loneliness. The river seemed redder than before, and the mountains were veiled in ruby haze. Earth and sky were bathed in the hue of sunset light, and Anthony descended to the river. He pushed off the boat and applied himself to the oars. His strong strokes, coupled with the current, sent the boat speeding along at about 10 miles an hour. As the rose faded from the sky, the clouds turned drab, the blue deepened, and a pale star shone. Twilight failed, and the air cooled. Anthony lay back on the oars and rowed more powerfully. Night fell, and the stars began to appear one by one, and then many by many. The night ride started to become thrilling, and Anthony knew there must be danger ahead. By night the river seemed vast, shadowy, and silent as the grave. Its silence wore on Anthony, and it began to feel unnatural. As the stars multiplied and brightened, the deep cut where the river wound changed its character, becoming dark and clear where it had been gloomily impenetrable. The dim, high outlines of the banks showed, and above them loomed the black domes of mountains. From time to time he turned the boat, and resting upon his oars he drifted with the current, straining his eyes and ears. These moments of inaction brought the cold, tingling prickle of skin up and down his back. It was impossible not to be afraid, yet he thrilled even in his fear. In the clear obscurity of the night he could see several yards ahead of him over the gleaming river. But the peril that haunted Anthony seemed more in the distant shadows, round the bends. What a soundless, nameless, unintelligible river! To be alone on a river like that, so vast, so strange, with the grand and solemn arch of the sky blazed and clouded white by stars, taught a lesson incalculable in its effects. The hour came when an invisible something like a blight passed across the heavens, paling the blue, dimming the starlight. The intense purity of the sky sustained a dull change, then darkened. Anthony welcomed the first faint gleam of light over the eastern horizon. It brightened, the wan stars faded, the mountains heightened their clearness of silhouette, and along the bold, dark outlines appeared a faint rose color, herald of the sun. It deepened, it spread as the gray light turned pink and yellow. The shadows lifted from the river valley, and it was day again. "Always I have slept away the great hour," said Anthony. An exhilaration uplifted him. He drifted round a bend in the river while once more eating sparingly of his food, and suddenly he espied a high column of smoke rising to the southwest. Whereupon he took the oars again, and having become rested and encouraged, he rowed with a stroke that would make short work of the few miles to the camp. Anthony stood on the muddy bank, pondering his next move. He had heard tales of a place called Picacho and decided to try his luck there. He carried a decent amount of money in a belt around his waist, the last of his inheritance from his mother, and he was determined to make it last as long as possible. As he approached the landing, he saw a small, run-down stern-wheel steamer resting on the mud. A weather-beaten man sat on the bow, fishing with a crooked pole. Across the bank stood a Mexican girl in a flowing serape, her dark dress contrasting with a single touch of red. Anthony docked his boat and climbed up to the fisherman, asking if this was Picacho. The man replied, "Mornin', stranger. Yep, this here's the gold diggins, and she's hummin' these days." Anthony was interested in the man's fishing and asked what he had caught. "I'll be doggoned if I know, but he was good to eat," the man replied with a grin. As they chatted, the man asked where Anthony was from. "Back east," he replied. The man was impressed that he had braved the Colorado River during flood season. When Anthony asked if he could find work in Picacho, the man assured him that he could get a good job if he was as straight as he looked. As Anthony trudged down the dusty road, he couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement. He had heard rumors of gold in the hills and was determined to strike it rich. As he walked, a rugged man approached him. "You're a husky lad," the man said, eyeing Anthony up and down. "If you stay sober, you could make a fortune in the diggins." Anthony's interest was piqued. "How about a place to eat and sleep?" he asked. "That ain't so easy to find up at the camp," the man replied. "It's a few miles up the canyon, but say, I'm forgetting about the fellow who stayed here with the Mexicans. They just buried him. You could get his place. It's the adobe house, first one. Ask Amy there, she'll show you." Following the man's directions, Anthony made his way up the bank. At the top, he saw a beautiful Mexican girl standing before him. "Buenos dias, señor," she greeted him with a smile. Anthony couldn't help but feel drawn to her dark, piquant little face and big, alluring eyes. Though his Spanish wasn't perfect, he managed to converse with her. As he talked, he felt a twinge of pain at the memory of another woman who had once captivated him, but as quickly as it came, the feeling passed. He was determined to start a new, freer life, and nothing would hold him back. Chapter 2. Amy responded to Anthony's questions with a timid, "Yes, sir," accompanied by the same alluring grin that had caught his attention. He then hoisted his backpack and trailed after her. As they moved away from the river, the sand grew denser and weightier, yet it remained pristine and ivory. The young woman guided him along a trail flanked by willow and mesquite trees, which eventually gave way to an open space housing a cluster of low adobe dwellings. Amy made her way to the first house she came across. The mother of the girl who greeted her seemed like a lazy person, not caring much about how she looked. She spoke to Anthony in English, but when he tried speaking Spanish, her face lit up with a smile that made her look pleasant. The little room she led Anthony to was poorly ventilated and unsatisfactory. Anthony expressed his disappointment, and the woman became very talkative. Amy conveyed her disappointment with just a glance. They then took him outside and under the low branching mesquites to a small structure. The hut had 2 rooms, one full of wood and rubbish, and the other, with an open front, faced the river. The empty room had a floor of white sand and seemed to be to Anthony's liking. He agreed on a price with the woman, which made her and Amy happy. Anthony felt uneasy about Amy's sudden affection for him, but he couldn't help warming up to her. He was a stranger in a new land, with a heart that ached for something. As Anthony unpacked, the women brought him a low bench, a bucket of water, and a basin, which were the only furniture in his new lodgings. He was to have his meals at the house, where they assured him he would be well taken care of. As they left, Amy's hair got caught in a thorny branch, and Anthony quickly came to her rescue. She then ran off after her mother, leaving Anthony with a warm feeling in his veins. "Well, it's a hard life, and not many strike it rich. You're young and strong, with a future ahead of you. There's better ways to make a living." Anthony nodded, but his mind was made up. He wanted to try his luck in the gold fields. "I understand," he said, "but I have to give it a shot. Maybe I'll strike it big, maybe I won't, but I won't know unless I try." Singleton sighed. "Well, I ain't one to discourage a man from following his dreams. Just be careful out there, young feller. There's danger around every corner, and not just from the elements and the rough terrain. There's men out there who will cheat and steal and kill for a nugget of gold." Anthony nodded again, his eyes shining with determination. "Thanks for the advice," he said. "I'll keep it in mind." With that, he bid Singleton farewell and headed out into the wilderness, his heart filled with excitement and trepidation. He knew the road ahead would be long and hard, but he was ready for whatever lay ahead. For he was a man on a mission, a man in search of his fortune, a man determined to strike it rich in the land of gold and opportunity. "I can take care of myself, no problem. This is a man's game, and I'll thrive in the desert," Anthony declared confidently. Singleton hesitated before responding. "I don't want to discourage you, son. It wouldn't be fair for me to assume you'll make the same mistakes I did or the ones I've seen other boys make. But I have to say, gold digging is a tough place for even the most seasoned old-timers, let alone a young man like you running wild." Despite Singleton's warning, he began telling tales of the history and adventure surrounding the gold mine. Gold was discovered at Picacho in 1864, and by 1872 a mill was erected near the river to process the ore that was mined 5 miles up the canyon and hauled down on a narrow-gauge railroad. The machinery and supplies for this great enterprise were transported from San Francisco steamers to the Gulf of California, then loaded onto smaller steamers and carried up the Colorado River to Picacho. These steamers also delivered supplies to Yuma and Ehrenberg, where they were loaded onto wagon trains and transported further inland. In 1878, the mine was flourishing, employing between 500 and 600 men. The camp was full of adventurers, gamblers, and a few unsavory women who caused trouble. "Down here at the boat landing and the mill, it's usually quiet," Singleton explained. "There aren't many men around. The gambling dens are all up at the camp where everyone goes in the evening. I've gambled in every gold camp in California, and I know the fever that grips a man. But I've never seen the good of gold to the man who dug it. So if you're asking for my advice, drink little, gamble light, and stay away from the females. Singleton, I might look tough, but I'm more of a tenderfoot than you think, Anthony replied. I never drank until I came out west a few months ago, remarked Anthony. I can't stand alcohol. Singleton's curious gaze was fixed on Anthony's face, which had lost its brightness and was now shadowed, though his eyes still held their frankness. Son, you're a strapping young man, and you've got looks no woman can resist, said Singleton. And in this country the preference of women can bring trouble. Well, for that matter, all the trouble anywhere is caused by them. But in the desert, where it's wild and hot and there are few females of any species, the fighting gets bloody. Women have been the least of my fights or troubles, replied Anthony. But lately I had a more serious affair that ended suddenly before I fell in too deep. Lordy, son, you'll be a lamb among wolves, exclaimed Singleton. Listen here, I'm going to set you straight. This country is no place for a nice, clean boy, which is a shame and a pity. Every man who makes it in the West, let alone in the desert where the West is magnified, has to live up to a certain standard. He must work hard, endure hardships, fight other men, and impress women. I'm not saying it's a fine standard, but it's the one by which men have survived in a tough country at a tough time. Survival of the fittest, muttered Anthony seriously. You've got it, son. That law governs all living things in this desert, whether man or otherwise. Quien sabe? You can never tell what's in a man until he's tried. Son, I've known desert men whose lives were beyond all understanding. But not one man in 1,000 can live in the desert. That has to do with his mind first, then his endurance. But let's come back to Picacho. I wouldn't be afraid to back you against it if you meet it right. How is that? Inquired Anthony. Lordy, son, I wish I could tell you the right word, replied Singleton earnestly. You ain't planning on turning back, are you? Asked Singleton. Nope, replied Anthony. I'm here for better or worse. Back home I had hopes and dreams, but they've all vanished. I don't have any close relatives except for a brother who's not my type. I didn't want to come west, but being here feels like being freed from a cage. This grand, wild desert will do something amazing or terrible to me. Well, you talk like you look, Singleton responded with a sigh. There was a time when my instincts weren't always right, but now that I'm older, I remember my youth more and love it more. You can trust me. Be a man with your body. Don't shy away from work, play, or fighting. Eat, drink, and be merry, but don't live just for that. Help others and be generous with your money. Set aside 1/3 of your earnings for gambling and expect to lose it. Never get drunk. You can't avoid women, good or bad, so be game, kind, and square. Game, kind, square, Anthony repeated thoughtfully. Well, I need a new fishing line, said Singleton as he reeled in his rod. Let's go to the store and then I'll take you to the mill. As they passed the adobe house where Anthony was staying, he asked Singleton about the people who lived there. Juan Carlos lives there, Singleton replied. He's the best Mexican foreman at the mill, and his wife is nice, too. But that black-eyed hussy Amy— Singleton shook his head but didn't finish his sentence. The suggestion piqued Anthony's curiosity. Soon Singleton gestured towards a group of huts and cabins, along with a rather grand stone house, low and square, with windows. Children of both white and dark complexion were playing in the shaded areas of the sand. Men were also present, lazily lounging in front of the stone building, which Singleton claimed was the store. Upon entering, Anthony was taken aback by the complete general store of groceries, merchandise, hardware, and supplies. However, he quickly realized how river steamers made transportation easy up until the border of the desert. Singleton then led Anthony towards a massive structure made of stone, iron, and wood that he had spotted from far up the river. As he approached, he heard the sound of steam escaping, the roar of heavy machinery, and the crushing of ore, along with the rush of flowing water. Singleton eventually found the manager, who was of medium height, powerfully built, and had an unshaven broad face, strong and ruddy. He wore a red flannel shirt, wet with sweat, a gun at his belt, overalls tucked into cowhide boots. Overall, he looked like a rough and practical miner. "Mac, shake hands with my young friend here," said Singleton. "He wants a job." "Howdy," replied the other, offering a big hand that Anthony certainly felt belonged to a man. He could sense one quick, all-embracing glance. "Are you good at figures?" "Why, yes," answered Anthony, "but I want to work." "All right, you can help me in the office where I'm stuck, and I'll give you outside work besides, tomorrow." And with this brusque promise, the manager hurried away. "Mac don't get time to eat," explained Singleton. Anthony couldn't help but laugh at the situation. He had been recommended by a stranger, hired to work for a man whose name he hadn't even heard, and no mention was made of wages. Anthony found this simplicity to be refreshing. In this country, a man was judged by who he was. After Singleton left, Anthony was left alone to ponder about his job at the gold mill. He didn't have a problem with hard labor, but the thought of sitting at a desk all day didn't appeal to him. As he looked out at the river and valley, he couldn't help but admire the scenery. The green surroundings softened the harsh ridges he stood on, and the river looked like it was made of red gold. It flowed through the iron gateway and majestically wound down the valley, disappearing behind a bold bluff. Anthony took a deep breath and realized that he was going to be captivated by this world of mountain wilderness and unexplored paths. Suddenly he thought of Amy, the girl who had made eyes at him. He didn't like the idea of having a deep and vague emotion for a girl who was roguish and coquettish with doubtful yet engaging possibilities. He shook his head, realizing that he was thinking too much and needed action. He needed to work, play, hunt, explore, even gold dig, anything that would change the scenery and move his muscles. These were the things that his body and soul needed. Chapter 3. The foreman, Carlos, didn't seem like the usual Mexicans that Anthony was used to living amongst. He wasn't a small, dark-skinned man, but rather well-built with a clean olive complexion and handsome features. After dinner, Carlos asked Anthony to come up to the camp with him. Amy chimed in and requested to come along. Carlos laughed and started speaking so quickly that Anthony couldn't keep up. He learned that the empty train carrying ore traveled up the canyon to the camp and stayed there until morning. Anthony also noticed that Amy didn't get along well with her stepfather. They seemed to be on the verge of a quarrel. However, the senora spoke a few soft words that worked magic on Carlos, though they didn't change the girl's passion. She turned her black eyes on Anthony, and he felt a new sensation. "Will you take Amy to the dance?" He translated her words. He felt embarrassed and hesitant, realizing the singular beauty of her big eyes, slow black and brilliant. Carlos put a hand on Anthony. "No, not tonight, maybe some other time." The girl's lips curled in pouting scorn, and with a wonderful dusky flash of eyes, she whirled away. Outside, Carlos led Anthony across the sands. "That girl, she's no blood of mine." "She's a damn little wildcat, much like an Indian on fire all the time," he said in English. Anthony felt a sense of shock and uncertainty. He had not fortified himself for such a wild idea of going to a dance this very night with a dusky-eyed little Spanish girl in a mining camp. "Man, that guy's huge, but he's young like a colt," Carlos said with a chuckle. "Tenderfoot, the gamblers would call him. He'll have tough feet soon enough on Picacho." "Well, Carlos, that can't come soon enough for me," Anthony replied, relieved to have someone to guide him. They made their way to the track where the ore train was waiting, filled with laborers in every car. After a long wait, the train finally started moving. The track was built a few feet above the sand, but it was clear that it had been submerged and washed out in places. The canyon was winding and narrow, with tunnels and holes dug into the red walls and gravel benches by prospectors searching for gold. As they continued on, they faced a considerable incline, and the 5 miles seemed to stretch on forever for Anthony. Finally, the train halted, and the laborers cheered. Carlos led Anthony up a steep, winding path, with the other men following in single file. When they reached a level spot, Carlos called out, "Picacho!" But it was not the wide, gravelly plateau with its shabby huts and adobe shacks that Carlos was pointing to. He meant the mountain that loomed over the town, the peak. Anthony gazed out at the mountain as the sun began to set. The mountain, with its bold knobs and ridges, was a dark purple mass framed by golden sunlight. From its summit, a long ray of ruddy gold shone down through a hole in the rocks. Even with the sun mostly blocked, the effect of the sunset was stunning, with a reddish haze filling the canyons and spaces. Picacho towered above them, crowned in gold and sculpted by the ages. It was a magnificent sight, aloof and unscalable. Anthony stood there wide-eyed and still as Carlos laughed and sauntered on. The passing Mexicans jabbered, and some white men made jocular comments at him. A little Irishman gaped and said to a comrade, "By God, he's seen a peanut atop old Picacho. What the hell now, my young friend? Come have a drink." The crowd passed, and Carlos lingered, rolling himself a cigarette. Anthony had not been prepared for such a spectacle of grandeur and desolation. He felt flung there, encompassed by colossal, immeasurable fragments of upheaved rock, jagged and jutted, with never a softening curve, all steeped in vivid, intense light. The plateau was a ridged and scarred waste, lying under the half-circle of range behind, sloping down toward where the river lay hidden. The range to the left bore a crimson crest, losing itself in a region of 1,000 peaks. The range to the right was a cold, pure purple, ending in a dim infinity. Between these ranges, far flung across the Colorado, the mountain world he had glimpsed from below loomed with exquisite clearness. Anthony perceived its marvelous, all-embracing immensity, magnified by the transparent light. Its limitless horizon line was an illusion, its thin, purple distances unbelievable. The lilac-veiled canyons lay clear in his sight, the naked bones of the mountains showing hungrily the nature of the desert earth. Over all the vast area revealed by the setting sun lay the awful barrenness of a dead world, beautiful and terrible, with its changing rose and topaz hues only mockeries to the lover of life. A hand fell on Anthony's shoulder. "Come, let's look at games of gold and women," said Carlos. He led Anthony into a big, poorly lit, low-ceilinged place as crudely constructed as a shed and full of noise and smoke. The attraction was a rowdy bar with various gambling games and some women drinking with men at the tables. The women looked ghastly and hawk-faced. Discordant music blared from an adjoining apartment. Anthony found the scene interesting but disappointing. His first sight of a wild frontier gambling den did not thrill him. Carlos liked to drink, talk loud, laugh, and take bold chances in gambling games. However, Anthony refused to drink and avoided it as long as he could. He wandered around by himself and found that everyone was merry and friendly. Anthony tried not to look at any of the women while they looked at him. The apartment from which the music came was a bare, canvas-covered room with a board floor where people were dancing. Anthony's aimless steps led him back to the sand-floored hall, where he became absorbed in watching a game of poker that a bystander said had no limit. Then Anthony sauntered on and was attracted by a quarrel among some Mexicans, which apparently concerned Carlos. All of them showed the effects of liquor and were gesticulating and talking excitedly. Suddenly, one of them drew a knife and lunged toward Carlos. Anthony saw the movement and the long, shining blade before he saw what the man looked like. That action silenced the little group. The outstretched hand, quivering with the skewer-like dagger, paused in its sweep as it reached a point opposite Anthony. Instinctively he leaped and quickly caught the wrist in a grip so hard that the fellow yelled. Anthony, now that he possessed the menacing hand, did not know what to do with it. With a powerful jerk he pulled the Mexican off his feet, and then, exerting his strength to his utmost, he swung him around, knocking over men and tables until his hold loosened. The blade soared in one direction while the Mexican flew in the other. He lay motionless where he fell. Carlos and his comrades fawned over Anthony. "We're pals now. You got a drink with me," declared Carlos in a grandiose manner. Despite appearing composed, Anthony was actually in dire need of something to invigorate him. "The kid's got a good arm," Carlos boasted as he nervously clutched Anthony's shoulder and biceps. "He'll be a giant one day." Anthony's emotions shifted from fear to foolishness as he stood there. He had another drink and his feelings transformed yet again, altering the entire atmosphere. He would never have been able to find the narrow path leading down into the canyon without Carlos as his guide. Walking on the sandy floor was tough and made him perspire. The loose sand and gravel weighed down his feet. Soon he had walked off the effects of the potent alcohol. He became inquisitive as to why the Mexican had threatened Carlos and was informed that the foreman had fired him earlier in the day. "He chased after Amy," Carlos continued, "so I kicked him out of the house. Women, man, they don't care who a guy is. Be careful around Amy. She's got as many lovers and lives as a spotted cat." However, the 2 men were mostly silent during the arduous trek. Eventually the canyon widened, allowing Anthony to see the vast expanse of sky dotted with flames and the mountain spurs which towered on all sides, stark and black against the blue. Carlos eventually announced that they had arrived home. Anthony had not seen any homes in the dim shadows, but a few more steps brought him into contact with tangible walls. He then took a deep breath and realized how weary he was. The pitch-black darkness slowly faded away, replaced by a dim, pale obscurity. The mesquite trees appeared as spectral outlines against the sky, and a single star twinkled in the distance. At first the night seemed completely silent, but as he strained his ears he could hear the rustling of mice and ground squirrels in the adobe walls. The sound brought him comfort, and when he felt something small run softly over his bed, he felt less alone. "I've started it," he whispered to himself, referring to the lonely life he had chosen. The silence, darkness, and loneliness made him think deeply. He was puzzled and alarmed by the swift changes he felt within himself. If he continued to change his mind every hour, he would be unable to make any progress in life. He would be at the mercy of his impulses, and his future would be hopeless. But could he control himself? His fine instincts, principles, hopes, and dreams began to contend with a new force within him. It was wilder and stronger than anything he had ever felt before. It was a strange, stirring, and powerful emotion. "But I'm glad," he burst out, as if confessing to the darkness. "Glad to be rid of Carl and his meanness. Glad to be alone. Glad to come to this wild desert. Glad that girl made eyes at me. I won't lie to myself. I wanted to hug and kiss her, and I'll do it if she lets me. That gambling den disgusted me, and the sight of the Mexican's knife scared me to death. As soon as I had him in my grasp, I could feel his feebleness. I could have easily crushed his bones with the strength I possessed. Despite my fear, I felt a strange, untamed sensation that still lingers within me. My life is changing, and I must face whatever comes my way with courage." The following day, Anthony was assigned to copy Cicada's scribbles with a lead pencil and keep a precise record of the ore that was mined and processed. It took him several days to catch up with his work and meet the deadline. Then Cicada kept his word and gave him a man's job for part of the day. The task Cicada assigned to Anthony was to maintain the fire under the colossal boilers. As wood was used for fuel and it was consumed quickly, stoking the furnace was no cakewalk. Moreover, the furnace was so hot that it felt like the sun was scorching down on him. Anthony was drenched in sweat, and he could wring water out of his shirt. That night, Carlos revealed to Anthony that Cicada was playing a prank on him. Even Amy was in on the joke. Cicada had many laborers for hard work, and he wanted to teach the greenhorn a lesson and cure him of his desire for a man's job. Anthony found it all amusing, and he thought he knew what he needed. In the meantime, he could have as much fun as Cicada. To Cicada's astonishment, Anthony showed up the next afternoon in boots, overalls, and an undershirt to continue his job of firing the engine. "Wasn't yesterday enough?" Cicada asked. "I can handle it," replied Anthony. Anthony was gratified to see a considerable amount of respect in the rough mill operator's expression. For a week he juggled his office work and labored every afternoon at stoking the furnace. Despite the obvious signs of exhaustion and weight loss, nobody suspected that he was suffering. Amy always welcomed him home with open arms, even though he tried to deny the sweetness of her gestures. One day, as he came home after a long day's work, she touched his blistered arm with her small brown hand, and her touch was filled with tenderness that only a woman could offer. All women seemed to admire men who could accomplish great feats of strength and labor, and the more impressive the task, the more they admired them. The following week, Cicada replaced a Herculean laborer with Anthony, who was far from being as strong. Anthony's father was a man of great stature and strength, and it was said that Anthony could grow up to be just like him. However, at 18 years old, he was far from reaching his full potential. The new job was incredibly painful for him, and he learned the true meaning of labor. He also learned that the only thing that common men respected in a co-laborer was the grit and muscle to endure the grind. Despite his struggles, Anthony persevered, and his spirit grew stronger as he realized that this was the life he was destined for. As time passed, Cicada's admiration and friendship for Anthony grew, and he gradually stopped teasing him. One day, while teasingly challenging Anthony to tip over a car filled with ore that two Mexican workers were laboring over, Cicada finally threw in the towel when Anthony effortlessly heaved the tons of ore into the shaft. In a true Western fashion, Cicada admitted defeat and shook hands with the young man. In just a few days, Anthony made friends who would change the course of his life. From Singleton, he learned about the legend and history of the frontier. Cicada opened his eyes to the benefits of hard work for both the mind and body. Carlos showed him the warmth of true friendship that could be found in anyone. As for Amy, she was still a mystery to Anthony's development. Their acquaintance had mostly taken place under the watchful eyes of the Senora or Carlos. Sometimes they would sit together on the sandbank at sunset, and Anthony began to appreciate her charm even more. Then an unexpected event occurred. The machinery broke down, and an invaluable part had to be replaced, which could only be found in San Francisco. Anthony found himself at a loss, unsure of what to do. Carlos warned him not to go panning for gold and to be careful if he went up to Picacho, as the Mexican Anthony had handled so roughly was the leader of a dangerous gang. It seemed as though all the signs were pointing Anthony towards Amy, who was always waiting around the corner, watching him with her mysterious eyes. Chapter 4. As time passed by at a leisurely pace, much like the majestic river that ruled over the desert valley, Anthony found himself abruptly jolted from his reverie when he recognized the peril posed by the dark-eyed damsel. It was during the tranquil sunset hour, while Anthony and Amy were admiring the river's shimmering golden glow as it flowed towards the west, that he came to this realization. They walked among the scattered mesquites along the sandy bank, a secluded spot hidden from the village but open to the wide river and valley beyond. The air was filled with marvelous tints of gold, rose, and purple. The majestic scene, both beautiful and melancholy, needed life to make it perfect. Anthony, drawn by Amy's sympathy, attempted to confide in her about the burden on his mind. He felt alone in the world, with only a hard gray future ahead of him, with no one to care whether he lived or died. Then came his awakening. It did not speak well for Amy's concept of proper behavior, but it proved her to be a creature of heart and blood. To be suddenly embraced by this slender, twining girl of Spanish nature was both a revelation and a catastrophe for Anthony. However, if he was staggered, he was also responsive, as he had vowed he would be in a moment of poignancy. A strong and shuddering power took hold of his heart, and he felt the leap, the beat, the burn of his blood. When he lifted Amy and held her in a close embrace, it was more than a hot upflashing of boyish passion that flushed his face and started tears from under his tight-shut eyelids. It was a sore hunger for something he couldn't name, a gratitude that he could only express through violence, a yielding to something deeper and more far-reaching than was true of the moment. Anthony loosened Amy's hold on his neck and held her back from him so he could see her face. It was sweet and rosy. Her eyes were shining, black and fathomless as night, soft with a light that had never shone upon Anthony from any other woman. "Do you love me?" he demanded, his voice breaking with eagerness. His stern look belied his boyish tone. "Ah," whispered Amy. "You're a big-hearted girl," he exclaimed with a joyful laugh that also had a hint of trembling. "Amy, I must love you too, since I feel so strange." He leaned in to kiss her, and in that moment he realized the danger he was in. These were the first real kisses he had ever received from a woman, and they threatened his principles. He pulled away from Amy, who didn't understand why. Her pouting reproach, her soft eyes, and her little brown hands that refused to let go of him further threatened his resolve. Anthony, teasing yet kind, tried to resist her advances. "Señorita, someone might see us," he said. "Who cares?" she replied. "But, my child, we must think," he urged. "Señor, no woman ever thinks when love is in her heart and on her lips," she retorted. Her response seemed to rebuke Anthony, revealing a truth about life rather than just this one girl's willful love. She appeared to him as someone with infinitely more strength and subtlety than he had expected. However, it wasn't the danger of her love that restrained him so much as the strange awareness of his willingness to meet her halfway. Suddenly, Amy's mood changed. She was like a cat that had been purring contentedly until it was stroked the wrong way. "Do you really love me?" she snapped, turning white. "Yes, I said so, Amy. Of course I do," he hastened to assure her. "Maybe you're just a gringo liar," she accused. Anthony might have taken offense at this insult, but his own uncertainty, embarrassment, and the thrilling nearness of her blazing eyes left him speechless. Amy looked like a mischievous little devil, but Anthony wasn't bothered by it. Instead, it confirmed his belief that she was careless and impudent. He knew that he shouldn't have pursued Amy, but it was too late now. He didn't regret it, but he was upset and needed to think. Suddenly, Amy spoke up, warning Anthony that if he played with her heart, she would cut his out. Her passionate words revealed her half-savage nature, and Anthony was both astounded and horrified. Despite his shock, he felt his blood tingle with excitement. Anthony tried to reassure Amy that he wasn't playing with her emotions and that he was glad she cared for him. He asked what he had done to upset her and what she wanted from him. Amy demanded that Anthony swear his love for her. His response was wild, revealing a side of him that was unexpected. Though he laughed and acted boldly, there was a seriousness in his eyes that couldn't be ignored. Amy's personality shifted once again, this time to one of pride, coldness, and aloofness. She wanted to be wooed back to tenderness, and Anthony was willing to do whatever it took to win her heart. As they walked home, Amy's moods changed rapidly, but Anthony didn't acknowledge them. When they reached her doorstep, he left her with the Senora and walked away. Once he was alone, Anthony breathed a sigh of relief. He couldn't believe he had sworn his love to Amy, who had threatened to cut his heart out. But despite her cat claws, he found her amazing and adorable. He wondered what his friend Carl would think of a girl like Amy. Standing on my own 2 feet with all my faculties intact, I, Anthony Fraser, couldn't believe what had come over me. I used to think I had principles, but now I'm a raving lover of a dark-skinned, black-eyed slip of a greaser girl. It seemed impossible, but it was true. With that outburst, I realized that my resolve not to dwell on my own thoughts and feelings was gone. I knew I would never make such a promise to myself again. For hours I walked up and down the sandy bank, lost in thought but aware of the night sky, the surrounding mountains, and the silent river winding away in the darkness. As I grew accustomed to being alone in the solitude and darkness, I felt a vague sense of affinity with nature. Success and people might fail and betray me, but the quiet, lonely nights under the stars would be my teachers, just as they were for the wise men of the Arabian desert. Eventually I gave up and went to bed, hoping to forget the complex mix of emotions and circumstances that made me feel so helpless. The desert seemed like an inhospitable place to me, devoid of comfort and culture. I had almost convinced myself that the physical challenges of the desert were good for me, but what about its spirit, mood, and passion as embodied by Amy Carlos? I asked myself that question, but all I got was a rush of hot blood at the memory of her sweet kisses. She was a simple child of the desert, like an Indian, responding to savage impulses without any awareness of the breach of womanly reserve and restraint. Was she good or bad? How could she be bad if she didn't know any better? Anthony sat and pondered, his mind racing with thoughts of Amy. He cursed his own ignorance and lamented his failings, all the while acknowledging his fondness for her. Despite his confusion, he knew that he owed it to Amy to live up to his principles. However, Singleton's remarks about the qualities needed to survive in the desert left Anthony feeling defeated. The harshness of the desert either molded a man into a fighter or snuffed him out like a candle in the wind. The next morning, Anthony awoke to the sweet, fresh, and new day. The dry, crisp air and the colors of the enchanting land made life worth living. He felt like a boy again. Amy's apology for her mood swings took a material turn when she prepared an unusually good breakfast for Anthony, who was always hungry. He enjoyed her attention and encouraged it, but only when the Senora and Carlos were not around. The former approved too obviously, and the latter disapproved too mysteriously. When a boat arrived later that day, Anthony was among the first to greet it at the dock. Sakata, the manager, arrived with a man and 2 women, one of whom was a beautiful blonde girl. The manager's beaming face showed relief that the repairs for the mill engine had arrived. Sakata introduced Anthony to the party, and the manager left his friends for Anthony to entertain. Anthony immediately liked the group, especially the pretty blonde girl. His task of entertaining them seemed more than agreeable. He gave them a tour of the small town before suggesting they visit the gold mill. It had been a while since he had been in the company of girls like those back home, lively, intelligent, and a bit shy. The mother and daughter invited him to lunch on their boat, making it a special day for Anthony. Time flew by, and before he knew it, it was time for the boat to leave. As the boat pulled away from the shore, he saw in the girl's eyes the same thought he had. They would never meet again. Anthony realized that he might not have another chance to meet someone like her if he continued living this adventurous life. He waved goodbye with all his heart, hoping she would remember him. As he turned to leave, he saw Cicada's laborers working on the dock. Reagan, a little Irishman who had been eyeing Anthony for a while, winked at Cicada and pointed at Anthony, saying, "Mac, that boy's a devil with women." Cicada laughed heartily, implying that someone else was involved as well. Suddenly Anthony turned and saw Amy standing there with the face and demeanor of a tragic queen. Her burning black eyes were focused solely on him. In one swift motion she turned and ran away, leaving Anthony stunned. He had completely forgotten about Amy's existence until that moment. She must have been watching him with her big eyes because she seemed to know exactly what he was thinking. As he made his way through the shady mesquites towards his hut, he suddenly spotted Amy hiding in the bushes. If his brother Carl had seen him in this predicament, he would have been delighted. Anthony, who always acted so superior, had finally met his match. Amy pounced on him before he even had a chance to react. She was a small, agile creature, full of fury. She hissed and cursed in Spanish as she scratched and slapped him, her fists flying wildly. He tried to push her away, but she kept coming back. In a fit of anger, he grabbed her and shook her with more force than he intended. When he finally let her go, he saw the white face framed by black hair and the fiery eyes that burned with passion. Those eyes were like nothing he had ever seen before, and he felt a strange mix of wonder and admiration. Desert eyes, he thought to himself. This girl was a spirit shaped by the harsh landscape that surrounded them. "Amy," he said, trying to reason with her, "I didn't do anything." But she wasn't listening. "I hate you," she spat, her breath coming in quick, angry gasps. Anthony was taken aback by the intensity of her emotions. She was so small and fragile, yet she held so much passion inside of her. He wondered what she would do if she had a real reason to be angry. "I gotta tell you something," she repeated with passion, and Anthony realized that he couldn't change her mind any more than he could move a mountain. Resentment stirred inside him. "Well," he burst out like a child, "if you're so darn fickle like that, I'm glad you hate me." With that, he let go of her arms and walked away without looking back, heading towards the glade. He grabbed the gun he had fixed and set off down the river trail, entering the bottomlands of willow and cottonwood. He moved silently, keeping an eye and ear out for any game. About a mile from the village, Anthony stopped in admiration of some beautiful trees. One of them was a species he had seen before, but this one was particularly impressive. It was about 5 times his height, with a full and round proportion. The trunk was thick at the base, branching out into countless other branches that spread out and drooped, dividing into a million twigs and stems. Every inch of the tree was a bright, soft green color, as smooth as if it had been polished, and not a single leaf was on it. As Anthony marveled at the beauty of this strange, unknown tree, he couldn't help but wonder at the marvels of the desert. As he walked around to the side facing the river, he heard a cry. He quickly turned around and saw Amy running towards him, her hair flying and her face covered in blood. She had torn her dress. "Amy," Anthony called out as he reached her. "What happened?" She was so out of breath that she could barely speak. "Felix is hiding back there on the trail," she panted. Amy was in a state of extreme agitation, but it wasn't fear that caused it. "Felix? You mean the Mexican guy who pulled a knife on your dad? The one I threw around up at Picacho?" Anthony asked. "Yes, sir," replied Amy. "So what's the deal? Why is Felix hiding up in the trail?" Anthony questioned. "Felix vowed to seek revenge. He wants to kill you," Amy said. "Oh, I see," Anthony said with surprise. He felt a hot, tight sensation deep inside him. "You came to find me and warn me?" he asked. Amy nodded vigorously and held on to him tightly, looking exhausted and weak. "Amy, that was really good of you," Anthony said earnestly as he led her into the shade of a nearby tree. He used his handkerchief to clean the scratches on her cheek from the thorns. Her dusky eyes shone with a different light than the hate that had been there before. "I appreciate it, and I won't forget it. But why did you run out in the sun and through the thorns to warn me?" he asked. "Sir needs to know that he has to kill Felix before Felix kills him," Amy said in a simple, deadly tone. Anthony chuckled grimly. He had been reminded before of the harsh reality of life in the desert. However, it wasn't his duty to ambush Felix, who was planning to ambush him. Despite this, the closeness of Amy made him feel warm inside. Her fragrance and breath were intoxicating. "But Amy, not too long ago you slapped me, scratched me, and hated me," he said with wonder and reproach. "No, no, no, Amy loves sir," she cried as she wrapped herself around him and climbed into his arms. The same fire and intensity that had been present during their moment of hate and passion were now present, except it was love. Anthony was once again drawn to Amy's red lips and returned her kisses. He felt a wild gust in his blood, as strange and imperious as it had been in a sober reflection. It was bold, physical, and not sanctioned by his will. Though weaker in its grip this time, he still conquered it. He led Amy to a shady spot under a green tree and found a seat where he could lean against a low branch. Amy fell against his shoulder and wept, her dusky hair rippling over him like silk. Her poor faded dress made of an unknown fabric, ragged and dusty and torn, and her little shoes, worn and cracked, spoke of poverty. The soles of her stockingless feet were visible. Anthony noted the slender grace of her slight form, the arch of her bare instep, and the shapeliness of her ankles, brown like an Indian's. Suddenly an overwhelming sense of the pitifulness and wonderfulness of her charged over him. She was a ragged, half-dressed little Mexican girl who took care of her hair and face with a few knots of ribbon, betraying the worshipful vanity that was the jewel of her soul. Her physical perfection was in strange contrast to her cramped, undeveloped mind. "My God," Anthony whispered under his breath. Something big and undefined was born in him then. He saw her, pitied her, loved her, and wanted her, but these feelings did not constitute the bigness and vagueness that waved through his soul. It had to do with the life, beauty, passion, and soul of this Mexican girl, and it was akin to a reverence he felt for the things in her that she could not understand. Amy made a quick recovery, and her demeanor changed to one of shyness, modesty, and wistfulness that Anthony hardly recognized her. He was careful not to provoke her other characteristics. "Amy, what's the name of this beautiful tree?" he asked. "Palo Verde. It means green tree," she replied. Anthony was intrigued and wanted to learn more about the desert's growth that was strange to him. He led Amy around to different points and was pleased to find out how familiar she was with every growing thing. Eventually, Amy showed Anthony a tree that looked like smoke, with a blue-gray, soft and hazy appearance against the sky, and columnar and mushrooming in shape. It was a strange, graceful tree that bore deep blue flowers. Upon close inspection, Anthony was amazed to find out that every branch and twig of the tree was a thorn. It was a hard, cruel, and beautiful tree of thorns that resembled smoke from a distance. "Palo Christi," whispered Amy, making the sign of the cross. She told Anthony that this was the crucifixion tree, the species that provided the crown of thorns for Christ's head. Anthony had several happy and productive hours before sunset. He hadn't forgotten about the Mexican, Felix, and thought it best to let time pass and avoid trouble for as long as possible. Anthony and Amy returned home without seeing any sign of Felix. However, Carlos had spotted the Mexican sneaking around and warned Anthony in no uncertain terms. Singleton also had a word for Anthony's ear, and it was significant that he didn't advise a waiting course. Despite all of Anthony's thoughts, he didn't need much encouragement. After supper, he traveled to Picacho with Carlos and a teamster who was hauling supplies up to the camp. Picacho was in full swing when they arrived. The dimly lit, rowdy gambling hall, with its pungent aroma of alcohol and the sound of boisterous shouts, had already stirred up Anthony's mind. After a few drinks, he was ready for anything. However, their search for Felix was in vain. Anthony, slightly inebriated, began to make his way back to his lodgings. The journey was a long and arduous one, made even more difficult by the heavy, dragging sand. Anthony arrived in the village, fully aware of his surroundings, but his blood was pumping from the exercise, and the anticipation of the upcoming fight had given way to a thrilling sense of adventure in the darkness of the starry night. As he walked through the pale light of the mesquites, Amy appeared before him like a graceful apparition, wrapping her arms around him and whispering sweet nothings. Anthony was powerless to resist her advances as he felt the thrill of youthful romance and the wildness of the place. Chapter 5. As the first light of dawn crept into the sky, Anthony's heavy eyelids slowly lifted. The dull gray desert landscape stretched out before him, and the weight of the night's events settled heavily on his mind. He knew that nothing would ever be the same again. A sudden pang of loss gripped him, as if something deep and instinctual within him had died. Anthony had always been different from his brother Carl, possessing a sweetness and purity that had been instilled in him by his mother's teachings. It had set him apart from the baseness that was all too common among their comrades. But the untamed wilderness of the West had proven to be too much for him. He could feel its wildness seeping into his soul, corrupting him in ways he could not even begin to understand. And now, as the sun rose higher into the sky, Anthony could only resign himself to his fate. Whatever lay ahead, he knew that he would never be the same again. The magic of life, the wonder that made him feel different from the other boys and kept his dreams alive, failed him on this cool, dark morning of reality. He couldn't understand why he was so hard on himself, and it left him feeling numb. The knot in his chest tightened, the weight of his remorse was unbearable, and a strange, dark oppression took over him until he felt like he was sinking. But then he thought of Amy, and suddenly everything changed. The memory of her surged over him like a hot wave, and he was filled with a new energy. He remembered her sweetness, her cunning, and the way she demanded his presence. He leaped out of bed, breaking the spell of his dark thoughts with violent action. For Anthony, the sunrise was glorious, the valley was beautiful, the desert was wild and free, and the earth was an immense region to explore. He felt like life had given him a sweet cup with a drop of poisoned bitterness. His heart swelled with hope, and he wished he could be an Indian. As he walked, he remembered something his mother had told him long ago. "My son, you take things too seriously. You feel too intensely the ordinary moments of life." He understood her now, but he couldn't help feeling that everything was important. How could anything be little? When he saw Amy, he was overjoyed. Her smile, the light in her eyes, made him feel happier than anything else. But there was something different about her this morning, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. He felt like he meant less to her than he had the day before. The sound of a shrill whistle echoed across the river, signaling the arrival of a downriver boat. As a result, idle men began to flock towards the dock. Upon reaching the open space on the bank before the dock, Anthony discovered an unusual number of men who were clearly more than ordinarily interested in something concerning the boat. By slipping through the mesquites, Anthony managed to get around to the edge of the crowd. There he saw a tall, gaunt man clad in black striding off the gangplank. His height, form, and gait were all too familiar to Anthony. He had seen that embroidered flowery vest with its silver star conspicuously in sight, and the brown beardless face with its square jaw and seamy lines. "Collishaw!" Anthony exclaimed in dismay. He recognized in this man one whom he had known at Ehrenberg, a gambling, gun-fighting sheriff to whom Carl had become attached. As his glance swept back of Collishaw, his pulse began to quicken. The next passenger to stride off the gangplank was a very tall, superbly built young man. Anthony would have recognized that form in a crowd of 1,000 men. His heart leaped with a great throb. It was Carl, his brother. Carl looked up, and his handsome, heated face, bold and keen and reckless, flashed in the sunlight. His piercing gaze swept over the crowd upon the bank. "Hello, Anthony!" he yelled with a gay, hard laugh. Then he prodded Collishaw and pointed up at Anthony. "There he is! We found him!" Anthony plunged away into the thickest of mesquites, and, indifferent to the clawing thorns, he did not halt until he was far down the bank. It was hard for him to suppress the regurgitation of brotherly love. It represented most of his life, all of his home associations and the memories of youth. The strength of it proved his loyalty to himself. How warm and fine that suddenly revived emotion. How deep-seated, beyond his control. He could have sobbed out over the pity of it, the loss of it, the fallacy of it. Ripped out from the roots, it still lingered deep inside of him. Anthony had fled to be alone, giving in to the shock, shame, and anger that had taken hold of him upon realizing that his own brother despised him. For years, Anthony's love had been at odds with the slowly growing truth of Carl's hatred towards him. He couldn't prove it, but he could sense it. Anthony wasn't afraid of Carl, nor was there any reason why he couldn't confront him, except for this overwhelming tenderness that he was ashamed of. Once he had pushed past the sentimental feelings, he would show Carl and Collishaw what he was really made of. Money was Carl's motive, with the added possibility of wanting to dominate and harass. "I'll outsmart him," Anthony said determinedly as he stood up to head back. He wasn't sure what he was going to do, but he knew he had reached his breaking point. He took a longer route back to the village, and turning a sharp bend in the canyon, he suddenly stumbled upon a group of workmen, mostly Mexicans. They were all standing under a wooden trestle that had been constructed across the canyon at this narrow point. Each of them appeared to be staring upwards, and so Anthony followed suit. Without warning, he caught sight of a distorted and gruesome face of a man hanging from a rope that was tied to the trestle. The sight sent chills down his spine. "That's Collishaw's doing," muttered Anthony darkly as he recalled the stories he had heard about the sheriff's ruthless acts of border justice. What a harsh country. Upon reaching the village store, Anthony met Singleton and asked him for more details about the execution. "Well, I don't know much," replied the old watchman, scratching his head. "There have been some placer miners who were shot and robbed up the river. This Collishaw is a real sheriff, taking the law into his own hands. Seems like there ain't no law around here. Well, him and his deputies claimed they tracked down that murdering gang to Picacho and swore they identified one of the members. Carlos stood up for that greaser, but there was a heated argument, and I thought Collishaw was going to draw on Carlos. But Carlos backed down like any sane man would. The greaser swore on all his virgins that he wasn't the one, and was even saying he could prove it before they hung him by the rope." "I don't know, Anthony, I don't know. I wanted to give the guy a chance, but Collishaw came down here to hang someone, and you bet he was going to do it," I said. "I know him, Singleton, and you're right. One of his men is a good-looking young guy who must be your brother, isn't he?" replied Anthony. "Yeah, you're right about that, too. Well, you don't seem too happy about it. Son, just be careful what you say to Collishaw. He's tough, and I reckon he's fair as he sees justice, but he doesn't sit right with an old-timer like me. He likes to impress the crowd. And he's been asking for you. Look, there he is now." The sheriff and his posse approached and stopped in front of the store. He was an imposing figure with a commanding presence, but his face was uninviting. His head was massive, with a bull neck of weathered skin like wrinkled leather. His face was broad and of a similar hue, with deep lines around his eyes and a thin-lipped, tight-shut mouth. His chin was square, and his eyes, dark and glittering, were constantly scanning the area, trained to spot men before they saw him. Anthony knew that Collishaw had seen him first, and so he marched over to the sheriff, determined to carry out the plan he had made in the thicket. "Hey, Frazier, I heard you were looking for me," said Anthony. "Howdy, Collishaw." "Yeah, I was wanting to talk to you," replied Collishaw with a Texan accent. "What do you need from me?" asked Anthony. Collishaw pulled Anthony aside so they could talk in private. "It's about the gambling debt you owe Carl," he said in a low voice. "Are you threatening me like you did to that poor Mexican?" Anthony asked sarcastically, gesturing towards the canyon. The hardened sheriff wasn't surprised by the comment and straightened up. "No, I can't arrest you for a gambling debt," he said bluntly, "but I'm going to make you pay." "Like hell you will," retorted Anthony. "What does this have to do with you? If Carl owed you money from that game, I'm not responsible, and I didn't pay because I caught Carl cheating. I'm not much of a gambler, Collishaw, but I'll bet you a stack of gold 20s against your fancy vest that Carl never collects a dollar of his crooked deal." With that, Anthony turned and walked towards the river. The injustice he had suffered at Ehrenberg added to his hard-earned independence. He saw himself in a different light. The anger he felt towards the girl involved in the situation had softened, and he realized that Amy had become everything to him. A gratefulness and warmth stirred in Anthony's heart for the dark-eyed Mexican girl. He knew he had to learn to adjust differences in class, race, and habit in this desert. As Anthony made his way through the sandy expanse leading to the river houses, he stumbled upon Carlos. The usually cheerful foreman looked ill, with a somber expression etched onto his face. Anthony was taken aback when Carlos refused to discuss the recent hanging. Instead, the conversation shifted to Carl Frazier, and Carlos had some advice for Anthony. "Who knows, sir," he said. "Maybe it's best for you. Amy is a fierce one. You're my friend, so I should tell you. But, well, if you want to keep Amy, watch out for your brother." Anthony was dumbstruck by Carlos's warning and had to take a moment to process it. What stuck with him the most was the fact that Carl had taken a liking to Amy. It was only natural. Carl had always managed to attract any girl Anthony had ever set his sights on. Back home, it had been a running joke among Anthony and his friends. But out here in the desert, where survival was a constant struggle, Anthony felt differently. He had grown attached to Amy and felt a sense of responsibility towards her. She was only 17 after all, and Carl's charm could easily sway her. But what if she wants Carl just as she wanted me? Anthony muttered to himself. He knew deep down that it was a possibility, but he refused to accept it. He knew what to expect, but his heart refused to doubt Amy. Just last night she had opened his eyes to a new way of life, not just a dream, but a reality. Anthony arrived at Carlos's home to find his wife alone. "Where is Amy?" he asked. "She's over there," Carlos's wife replied, gesturing towards the riverbank. Anthony spotted Carl and Amy sitting together on the sandy shore, shaded by a mesquite tree. They were close together, gazing out at the beautiful scenery. They didn't hear Anthony approaching. "My beautiful Spanish princess," Carl was saying to Amy. "You're like the moon and stars hidden away in this desert town. I fell in love with you at first sight." His hand was placed boldly on her shoulder. Suddenly Anthony appeared, walking around the wheels to confront them. It was a difficult moment for him. Despite the turmoil he felt inside, he remained calm and composed. Amy's expression changed from joy to surprise. "Well, if it isn't Anthony," Carl exclaimed, "you've changed." Anthony began to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. Seeing his brother again after all these years was overwhelming. Carl's presence was powerful, and Anthony had always looked up to him. Carl's face was stunning, yet strong and masculine. The man before him was a sight to behold. His features were perfect, from his big curved mouth to his square chin, straight nose, large hazel-green eyes, broad forehead, and clustering fair hair. His clear brown-tan skin had a hint of red, making him all the more striking. Anthony couldn't help but notice the wildness in Carl's expression, intensifying his godlike beauty. But Anthony knew better than to be deceived by Carl's looks. The man was false to his core. "Anthony, are you going to shake hands?" Carl asked lazily, extending his arm. "You sure strike me queer, boy." "No," Anthony replied, quickly noticing Carl's slipshod speech. Even the uncouth West had influenced his language. "All right, suit yourself," Carl shrugged. "I reckon you see I'm rather pleasantly engaged." "Yes, I see," Anthony returned bitterly, glancing at the woman beside Carl. She had recovered from her surprise and was now showing her feminine curiosity. "Carl, I met Collishaw and he had the gall to confront me about that gambling debt, and I've come to tell you that you cheated me. I won't pay it." "Oh, yes, you will," Carl smiled. "I will not," Anthony said forcefully. "Boy, you'll pay it or I'll take it out of your hide," Carl threatened, his frown deepening as he noticed a change in Anthony's demeanor. "You can't take it that way or any other way," Anthony retorted. "But say I didn't cheat," Carl remonstrated, making a last-ditch effort to win the argument. "You lie," Anthony flashed. "You know it, I know it. Carl, let's not waste any more words." "Yes, that's her name," confirmed Anthony, his voice softening as he turned to Amy. "I came to take her away from all this. Away from you." Amy looked up at Anthony with a mixture of fear and hope in her eyes. She had been under Carl's control for too long, and the idea of leaving with Anthony was both terrifying and exhilarating. "You can't just take her away," protested Carl, regaining some of his composure. "She's mine. I paid for her fair and square." Anthony's eyes blazed with anger. "You paid for her? Like she's some kind of object?" he spat. "No, Carl, you don't own her." With that, Anthony took Amy's hand and led her away from Carl. As they walked, Anthony whispered words of comfort and encouragement to Amy, promising her a better life away from the abuse and control of Carl. Amy looked up at Anthony with tears in her eyes, grateful to have finally found someone who would protect and love her. "Is this one of your goody-goody tricks, Anthony?" Carl sneered at his friend as they approached a young woman in distress. "You and I have fallen out over this kind of thing before." "We've fallen out forever," Anthony interrupted firmly, turning to the girl. "Amy, I want to help you." "But it's none of your business," Carl snapped back. "What do you care about a Mexican girl? I won't stand your interference. You clear out and let me alone." "It is my business," Anthony replied, his words halting. "She's my girl." "What?" Carl exclaimed, incredulous. He leaned in to look at Amy's face before turning back to Anthony with a sharp, intense gaze. You don't mean you're on friendly terms with this greaser girl? Yes, Anthony admitted, bracing himself for Carl's reaction. You've made love to her, Carl cried out, a fiendish glee lighting up his face. Yes, Anthony said, feeling his heart sink in his chest. He knew how far he had fallen in Carl's eyes, and he fought to maintain his composure and dignity. In matters of the heart, where two gentlemen admire the lady in question, the choice is always left to her, Carl mocked, his voice rich with sarcasm. The moment was dark and hateful, and Anthony couldn't help but wonder what the future held for him and Amy. A wicked grin spread across Carl's face, and despite Anthony's struggle to maintain his composure, he couldn't help but be captivated by Carl's charm and charisma as he bowed before Amy. "But Carl, you've only just met Amy," Anthony protested weakly, his voice betraying his nervousness. "How can you ask her to choose between us? It's insulting." "Anthony, that decision is for Amy to make," Carl replied smoothly. "Women change. It's something you haven't learned yet." Turning to Amy, he seemed to radiate magnetism and grace, embodying the emotions that he so effortlessly controlled. He knew how to wield his power over women. "Amy, Anthony and I are brothers. We always fall in love with the same girl. You must choose between us. Anthony would tie you down and keep you from other men. I would set you free like a bird." As he whispered in her ear, his hand rested firmly on her arm, both gallant and commanding. The scene was a nightmare for Anthony, a surreal experience that he couldn't believe was actually happening. But he could see it with his own eyes. Amy looked transformed, shy and coy, yet alluring, with eyes that glowed with the same fire that had once shone for Anthony. "Amy, please come with me," he pleaded, desperate to end this situation. But she shook her head, a slight smile playing on her lips. She seemed to radiate a strange ethereal glow, older and more sure of herself than Anthony remembered. He sensed a deeper, more mysterious passion in her that he couldn't quite grasp. "No," she replied softly, and with that the decision was made. Anthony knew that Amy would never understand the depth of his commitment to her. She was too focused on her own physical beauty and the power she held over men. He realized that she was searching for a new conquest, someone stronger and more difficult to control. This realization caused him great sadness, and any feelings of love he had for her were extinguished. He tried to remind her of the previous night they had spent together, but she dismissed it as a distant memory. Anthony was overcome with emotion and ran into the thicket of mesquites, ignoring the pain of the thorns scratching his skin. When he finally made it back to his quarters, he collapsed onto his bed. As he lay there, he thought about the situation with Carl and how it was all too familiar. He had dreamed of a future with Amy, but now he knew that it was never meant to be. He had never truly loved her, but instead was infatuated with the idea of her. It was Carl's presence that hurt him the most, and he couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. He wondered if all women were like Amy, focused only on their own pleasure and power. But he couldn't bring himself to believe it, remembering his own mother and the love she had shown him. Chapter 6. In the wee hours of the night, Anthony jolted awake. The darkness of the desert enveloped him, its coolness seeping into his bones as he lay under the mesquite trees. The stillness was eerie, not even a whisper of wind or rustle of brush could be heard. Anthony strained his ears, but the silence remained unbroken. Not a single creature stirred in the vast expanse of the desert. As Anthony slept, something jolted him awake. A voice, a cry, a whisper, he couldn't quite tell. Was it Amy calling out to him? He had experienced similar strange occurrences before, leading him to believe he had some sort of mystical ability. But as the morning sun shone through the window, the night's oddities faded away, leaving him eager for action. It was Sunday, another day of waiting and brooding, but he refused to hide in the willow brakes to avoid Carl and Collishaw's wrath. Instead, he decided to head up to Picacho to gamble and drink with the other drifters. Singleton's words echoed in his mind, but he couldn't help himself. He just wanted one more look at Amy's face, to gaze into her dark eyes and then be done with her forever. At breakfast, Carlos and the Senora seemed distant and unapproachable. Amy was still asleep, adding to the uneasy feeling that hung in the air. Anthony went for a walk along the river and through the village, learning from Singleton that Collishaw, Carl, and their crew had already left for the mining camp. Singleton warned him to stay away from Picacho, but Anthony paid him no mind. He was determined to have his fun, Consequences be damned. Anthony struggled to contain his impatience as he longed to head up the canyon to see Amy. He paced back and forth from the village to the river and back again. Eventually he spotted Carlos and his wife, along with their friends, dressed to the nines as they made their way to the small adobe church. However, Amy was nowhere in sight. Anthony waited, hoping she would show up as she usually did on Sundays. As time passed with no sign of her, he made his way to her little brown house and walked inside. "Amy!" he called out, but the only response was silence. He called out again, and this time she appeared, looking drained and pale. "Mr. Adams," she stuttered. The sight of her and the sound of her voice made something snap inside of him. He lunged at her, pulling her into the light of the doorway. She let out a cry of fear that shook him to his core. When he let go of her, she threw her arms up in defense. "Do you think I would hurt you?" he demanded, his voice harsh. "No, Amy, I just wanted to see you one more time." She dropped her arms and lifted her face to his. In that moment, Anthony saw a flicker of fear that betrayed her. What had been a playful and passionate dalliance yesterday had turned into dishonor overnight. Yesterday she had been like a cat that enjoyed being petted, but today she was like a wounded creature, a broken woman. "Look at me," Anthony said hoarsely, reaching out to touch her. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. She lifted her face to meet his gaze, unashamed and not denying anything. In that moment her face held a certain soulfulness that stuck with Anthony forever. It revealed the harsh reality of her fragility and the bravery of her primitive nature, which feared only death and yearned for brutal blows as proof of the survival of her jealous love. It also showed a growing awareness of his honesty and truth. It was a terrible realization for Anthony to know that if she had the chance to choose again, she would have made a different decision. But it was too late. "Goodbye, miss," he said, bowing, and backed out of the door. He stopped as her small, pale face with its tragic eyes passed out of his sight. Anthony walked quickly up the canyon, his intense energy matching his thoughts. He caught up with the Irishman, Reagan, who greeted him. "Hello, Wansfell, old friend," he called. "Don't walk so damn fast." "Why do you call me that?" asked Anthony. The name sounded peculiar to him. "Isn't that your name?" "No, it's not." "Well, all right. Do you want a drink?" Reagan produced a brown bottle and handed it to Anthony. They continued up the canyon, with Reagan struggling to keep up with Anthony's long strides. The Irishman was talkative and friendly, and whenever he got out of breath, he stopped to take a swig from the bottle. The alcohol would have normally clouded Anthony's thoughts, but now it only heated his blood. "Wansfell, you're the finest young man in these parts," exclaimed Reagan. "Thank you, friend, but don't call me that strange name. My name is Anthony," he replied. "Adam," echoed Reagan. "What a hell of a name. I saw you with that black-eyed girl. She's pretty." They finished the bottle and continued on their way. Reagan became more enthusiastic about Anthony and proposed that they go on a prospecting trip. "You would make an excellent prospector, partner," he said. "Out in the desert you are free and happy. There's no place like the desert, partner, once you get to know it. There's fresh air to breathe, long days with the sun on your back, and nights when a man knows how to sleep. Maybe we'll have the luck to find Pegleg Smith's lost gold mine." "Who was Pegleg Smith, and what gold mine did he lose?" asked Anthony. As they made their way up the canyon, trying to stay in the shady areas and out of the hot sun, Anthony heard the story of the famous lost gold mine for the second time. Reagan told the story differently, perhaps exaggerating like many prospectors do. However, the story was compelling to any man with a sense of adventure. Although Anthony had not yet been bitten by the gold bug, he had started to feel the pull of the desert. Anthony thought that under different circumstances, Reagan would be a man worth getting to know, despite his love for the bottle. They arrived at the camp around noon and had lunch at a Chinese vendor. Then they went into the saloon and mingled with the crowd. Anthony soon lost sight of Reagan in the sea of people. Booze flowed like water, and gold was being exchanged left and right. Anthony had one drink, which led to another. The warmth of the alcohol subdued the coldness and bitterness in his heart. He continued to drink, ignoring the voice of reason until he was in a dangerous and reckless state. It was as if a fire was consuming him, and the liquor was only fuel. As he swaggered through the crowded hall, the drunken miners, painted hags, and cold-faced gamblers didn't disgust him for once. The smell of rum and smoke, the feel of the thick sand under his feet, The sight of the motley crowd of shirt-sleeved and booted men, the discordant din of music, glasses, gold, and voices, all these sensations struck him full and intimately with their proof that he was a part of this wild assembly of free adventurers. He remembered Singleton's idea of a man equipped to cope with this lawless gang and hold his own. Suddenly, when he saw his brother Carl gambling with Collishaw and Cicada and other men of Picacho, he shook with the driving passion that had led him there. Carl looked the worse for liquor and bad luck. When he glanced up to see Anthony, a light gleamed across his hot face. He dropped his cards, and as Anthony stepped near, he rose from the table and confronted him with the manner of a man dangerous to cross. "I want money," demanded Carl. Anthony laughed in his face. "Go to work. You're not slick enough with the cards to hide your tricks," replied Anthony in deliberate scorn. Temper and not forethought actuated Carl then. He slapped Anthony with the moderate force of an older brother punishing an impertinence. Swift and hard, Anthony returned that blow, staggering Carl, who fell against the table but was upheld by Collishaw. He uttered a loud and piercing cry. Sharply the din ceased. The crowd slid back over the sand, leaving Anthony in the center of a wide space, confronting Carl, who still leaned against Collishaw. Carl panted for breath. His hot face turned white except for the red place where Anthony's fist had struck. Cicada righted the table, then hurriedly drew back. Carl's fury of astonishment passed to stronger, controlled passion. He rose from Collishaw's hold and seemed to tower magnificently. He had the look of a man who had been waiting for years to exact revenge. "You hit me, I'll beat you for that, I'll smash your face," he said, his voice strident. "Come on," Anthony replied. Just then an Irishman named Reagan stumbled out of the crowd, clearly drunk. "Sick 'em, Wansfell, sick 'em," he bellowed. "I'm with you, we'll lick that lousy face in every dam." Before he could finish, a miner pulled Reagan back. Carl Fraser slammed his fist down on the table, a look of pure hatred on his face. It was clear that this wasn't just a petty argument or jealousy. There was something deeper, something that had been building for years. "So that's your game," Carl said, his voice filled with passion. "You want to fight and you're using this debt as an excuse. But I know the truth. It's because of the girl I took from you." "Shut up! Have you no sense of decency? Can't you be half a man?" Anthony shouted, his body trembling with anger. "Ha, ha, ha, listen to goody-goody, mother's nice boy," Carl sneered. "By heaven, Carl Fraser, if you speak of my mother here, I'll tear out your tongue," Anthony threatened.